After years of mediocre profits and lukewarm reception, Square finally struck gold with the release of Final Fantasy, a classic turn-based RPG that would influence the industry for years to come. Meet Akitoshi Kawazu, a man whose philosophy is to take established conventions and brutalize them with a chainsaw. He designed the battle system for the first two entries in the series, and Final Fantasy II is of particular note for its highly exploitable mechanics, a ton of bugs in its original release, and people parroting the horribly misguided advice of grinding for hours, which is stupid and a waste of time, and god I could talk about it for hours. The rest of the team considered his ideas a bit too eccentric for the general public, so it was decided that Final Fantasy III would return to a more familiar type of RPG. But Kawazu got his time to shine when he was put in charge of directing a brand new franchise where he could put his crazy ideas to work. And so came to be Makai Toushi SaGa. That kanji soup roughly translates to Tower Warrior of Hell, but you might know it better as Final Fantasy Legend, a name chosen by Square's Western department, mostly for the sake of marketing purposes. The game certainly could pass as a Final Fantasy spin-off, and it does inherit some aspects. The infamous Warmech from Final Fantasy I shows up as a boss, and in the Japanese script the names of magic spells are the same as the Final Fantasy series. But beyond the superficial, Saga established itself as its own thing right from the very beginning. The story revolves around a tower at the center of the world. It is said that this tower leads to paradise, but all who challenged it have yet to return. And of course, you play as another hopeful hero, seeking to find the truth behind the tower and without dying horribly. Simple enough premise, but you quickly realize that there's more to the tower than simply being a tower. The journey starts in your world, which is located at the bottom layer, but after finding a sphere that unlocks the door, you will find out that the tower is more of a central hub that leads to different worlds, from tropical utopias where nobody has to work, to literally hell. Aside from a twist at the very end, the game's story is the absolute bare minimum, but it's not the story beats themselves that drives you forward. It's the secrets of the tower. The bottom layer is comprised of a fairly average fantasy world, but then you visit a land where there is almost no land, then a world where everyone lives on clouds, and finally a post-apocalyptic wasteland where a Sesame Street bootleg kills everyone who fails to escape its assault. Between the four main worlds there is plenty of weirdness to be discovered, like a small lake where octopus people live in a constant state of rain that comes from the room located directly above. Mixed together with some unusual character designs, the tower feels bizarre and alien, so different from the standard fantasy setting of the first tower of the game. If I didn't find it so amusing, I might have just called it a nonsensical mess created by an absolute lunatic. And speaking of messes created by absolute lunatics, one of the game's most unique aspects is the party customization, which involves 3 races that grow in power in vastly different ways. You begin the game by selecting the protagonist, a male or female human, a male or female mutant, or one of 4 monsters. After that, you can recruit up to 3 more party members for free without limits. Go all humans, go all mutants, go all monsters, mix and match. It's all up to you. The first thing to know about the mechanics is that Saga doesn't have levels or experience points. The second is that there are 5 stats. HP is obvious, strength increases damage with strength-based weapons, agility increases your speed and the damage dealt with agility-based weapons, defense decreases the damage characters take, and mana increases damage dealt with magic. Humans are very versatile and can equip anything, although they are terrible with magic because their mana stat is locked to 0. Their defense raises from simply equipping armor, but their HP, strength and agility has to be increased by taking vitamins that you can buy on most stores. Yes, I know what you're thinking. Buying items to raise stats? That sounds very exploitable. And you know what? You're absolutely right. The items are cheap, so you can roid them up into dealing stupid amounts of damage even with the weakest weapons in the game. In a way, it's kind of genius, because it means that early game weapons stay relevant throughout the entire game, and buying more expensive ones becomes various degrees of overkill as the character's stats increase. This is influenced by another unique aspect of the game, which is the limited inventory and the fact that items have a limited number of uses. The party's inventory is limited to 8 slots, and humans also have 8 slots of their own to place anything in. Everything takes up a slot, but everything also runs out of uses at some point, so you have to balance it out and make sure that you have enough weapons for the trip. Mutants have it worse, because they can equip the same things that humans can, but they only have 4 available slots. The other 4 are exclusive to their abilities, and this is where things can get really silly. Here's the thing about mutants. They mutate. After every single battle, there is a chance that their base stats will increase, and there is also a chance that one of their ability slots will change to something else, and that something else is completely random. It's surprise mechanics at their most pleasurable and frustrating, which is just the kind of sucker punch you should expect from this series. If you get a really good ability, don't be afraid to use it. In fact, abuse the hell out of it, sing a prayer, build a shrine to it, because at any moment it could be replaced with a pile of dicks. Thankfully, ability uses can be recovered by healing at inns, and while you can't exploit the mechanics like you can with humans, mutants still grow at a solid pace. Their mana stat grows particularly fast, which lets them nuke everything with offensive magic, and it just so happens that a select few late game weapons scale with mana. Finally, you have the monsters. At the end of a battle, there is a chance to find an enemy's meat, and your own monsters can eat it to transform into different species, each with their own fixed stats and abilities. The way it works is that every species of monster has a hidden level, and when eating meat, the game looks at your current species and the species of the enemy that dropped the meat, and then picks the highest level. It then combines the 2 species and you get the result of that particular combination. The monster's current stats and abilities will be replaced by those of the resulting species, which, yes, this means that monsters can't equip anything, but at least you can restore each ability's uses at inns. Since stats are the exact same as enemies, it also doubles as a way to learn about each enemy's strengths and weaknesses. Almost like there's a method to this madness. It's sort of like a crossbreeding system in the vein of Dragon Quest monsters, but without the making some kind of sense part. Dingus has become garlic! Enemies that share the same sprite are all categorized within the same monster group, but there's like 25 of them, and it doesn't seem like the combinations follow any pattern or logic, so there's a lot of trial and error. As for combat itself, it's a simple turn-based system where each participant chooses an action and then they hit each other until one side falls over. But since this is a potato game from 1989, enemies of the same species are represented by a single sprite, with a number indicating how many of them are there. The quirk is that single target attacks seem to hit enemies in order, so in a way groups of enemies function like HP stacks. But each individual enemy still gets their own turn, of course. The game also doesn't redirect attacks targeting an enemy that is already dead. Thankfully, the attack is simply cancelled, so you don't waste your item's uses. Lastly, the game has a form of permanent death, which might sound scary when some enemies can deal so much damage. Every party member has 3 hearts, and they lose one every time they are defeated. If all hearts are lost, the character dies for good. It sucks to lose a strong character, but in practice it isn't a problem, because you can buy extra hearts, and by the middle point of the game, 10,000 gold is chump change. Plus, you can save the game anywhere and save scum if you really want to. Filthy casual. There's also no defend command. Instead, that action is relegated to shields, which have limited uses and don't provide any extra defense just by equipping them. They have to be used in battle to do anything. Which, yeah, that makes shields kinda garbage. And I guess that's one of the biggest problems with this game. Saying that there is a method to this madness doesn't change that it is still madness, and calling the gameplay broken is an understatement. The whole system is so utterly unbalanced and easy to abuse that it actually circles around into being clever and entertaining to exploit. Saga's wild ride is certainly fun, but as a critical bastard with a YouTube channel, it's exceedingly easy to poke giant holes in it. I already gave you the example of abusing vitamins to raise human characters into destroyers of worlds, but if you're familiar with the game, you might already know that there's a way to insta-kill every boss, to tear God in half with a chainsaw. Vitamin abuse also means that by comparison, mutants and especially monsters tend to be very weak at the start. Unless you get very lucky with the random abilities and stat growth, they are vulnerable to getting wrecked in 1 or 2 hits. Actually, scratch that. Monsters are overwhelmingly weak until the very end of the game, where they become alright, but still completely outclassed by humans and mutants. There are some decent combinations to learn, but without a guide you might spend most of the game with monsters that are completely friggin' useless. Many only have one offensive ability, and those also tend to have a very limited number of uses. And remember that your monsters have the exact same stats as enemies, which is probably why most of their physical attacks are utterly pathetic. The only species worth using are those with healing or offensive magic. The very design of the mechanics means that there's a limit to how strong monsters can become in relation to enemies, while humans and mutants can be far stronger. While actually humans have an even higher limit. The game only counts up to 99, but their stats can actually grow all the way to 255, at which point injecting any more steroids will cause the value to loop back to 0. Oops. Yeah, that's something you'll have to be able to tolerate about this game. The developers must have been working with a budget of 1 tooth-breaking peanut, because holy hell, this game is barely holding together with hopes and dreams. Saga is 100% certified jank. It's not just the graphical glitches, or the dungeon layouts being supremely basic, or the graphics being so primitive that sometimes the ground is literally just a flat color. The problem is that the interface is slow and clunky, and you have to manage everything one by one. You can also throw away important items required to progress, so to make sure the player doesn't get stuck, the game simply lets you get infinite copies of those items. Oh, and you know that part about mutants randomly changing stats and abilities? Yeah, well, the game doesn't tell you anything, you have to track it yourself. The cherry on top is that the English translation was done in-house by Square, meaning that the dialogue is riddled with errors, pointless name changes and awkward phrasing. Hey, I found a shoe! Not that there's much to read in the first place, given that there must be, like, 50 plot-related lines in total, and it has so little substance and goes by so fast that any attempt at being emotional falls flat on its own wet ass. This original version of Saga is an interesting beast to talk about, but in this day and age you will want something more polished. And that's where the 2002 Wonderswan Color remake comes in, which eventually got a fan translation so you're not left with communicational blue balls. This version of the game doesn't even attempt to rethink the quirks of the original gameplay and story, for better or for worse. It embraces those quirks and focuses on injecting the game with visual splendor and tons of quality of life improvements. You know, making sure the game doesn't feel like it's about to implode with every button press. The inventory got a much needed rework, with key items being relegated to their own space, so that the game doesn't have to rely on botched solutions like giving you infinite copies of items. The only disadvantage is that you can't equip the king items from the first world anymore, but those were always just a very temporary crutch that lasted for all of 20 minutes. The battle mechanics are the exact same. Some undesirable bugs were fixed, but otherwise items and enemies kept their original stats. This means that monsters are still trash, but at least you can make a more informed decision now, because it tells you what species the monster will transform into. This removes the trial and error factor that the system suffered from, and helps the player understand and make sense of it. Monsters you've transformed into also get recorded into a bestiary that lets you see detailed information, and being in color means that enemies of the same type now have different colors, instead of looking exactly the same. Other niceties like descriptions for items and abilities and a run button were added, and attacks targeted at dead enemies are now redirected to the next enemy group by default, so you no longer waste turns. And if you're a purist and don't want attack redirection or transformation results, you can just turn them off and play the way God's two separated halves intended. The original game is even included as a bonus, so nobody loses here. No, it's not translated, but there isn't much reason to play it anyway. The only change is that menus are a bit faster, and that's probably just a side effect of converting the game to run on the Wonderswan, which runs at 75 Hz instead of 60. So yes, if you're interested in playing this classic, I highly recommend skipping straight to the remake. It plays a lot better while keeping the spirit of its source material. There's also a port for the Nintendo Switch and PC included in the Collection of Saga compilation, but it's pretty bare bones, and again, you're better off playing the remake, which isn't included. What a missed opportunity. But whichever way you go, Makai Toushi SaGa is bananas. It's weird, it's crazy, it's obtuse, it's unbalanced as all hell. And that's exactly why it's so interesting.